Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be doing an update on the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, Bitcoin is still relegated to our metaphorical sandbox once again, as we've had yet another weekly close below the 20-week SMA. Now, the silver lining on this metaphorical sandbox is that the sandbox is actually taking place at levels above where the prior sandbox was. We were below the 20-week SMA over here. All right. So if you're curious where the bull market support band is today, it currently ranges from around 51.3K for the 21-week EMA and 52.9K for the 20-week SMA. So more or less, it ranges from 51 to 53K. I think to be conservative, we just basically have to say, look, anything below 53K, certainly no one is getting out of bed for. Okay, the reason why? Well, look, I mean, it's still below the 20-week SMA, and it's hard to get bullish, at least in the short term, if Bitcoin is still below the 20-week moving average. Now, that's not to say that some people won't get excited for a $51,000 or $52,000 Bitcoin. I mean, if Bitcoin were to pump to 51, 52K this week, I know a lot of people would be excited about that. But the thing is we have to remain conservative on this and not have high expectations in the short term, because you see what happens. I mean, how many people do you follow that tell you that this is the bottom, and then the next week, oh no, just kidding, it was this one. I mean, this one. Oh no, we're going to turn around here, and we just keep going down. So these short-term predictions on when things are going to happen are very difficult. And some people ask me, well, how come you don't make a prediction? Look, it's just foolish. Like, it doesn't matter what the prediction is. That's the point. If you're asking the question, you're asking the wrong question. No one knows when the downtrend will end. Simply no one knows that answer. Back over here, I said I think we're going to spend 3 to 6 months playing in the sandbox. Okay, and it ended up working out relatively well. Because it took about 3 months below the 20-week SMA, and then about 3 more months before we put in new all-time highs. I mean, one of the reasons I came up with that is just because historically we know that once we fall below the 20-week SMA, it generally takes around 6 months or so to get back above it and then try to hold it as support again. Now, this is not something that has always played out like that, but it has been something that we've seen out in recent memory. So you can see it took about 3 months to get back above it, and then closer to about maybe about 5 months or so before we held it as support. So today, people want to know, well, I still do see remnants of people's theories being thrown around in terms of December, and there's still people that are saying we're going to have a parabolic rally that's going to in December green. I know most people think that's absurd, and it is absurd, right? It is pretty absurd to say that. Of course, there's maybe one universe in the multiverse where that happens, but I don't think the probability of something like that is high. So I would not be taking a prediction to say that we're going to go parabolic in the next week and a half to the bank, because it's almost assuredly not going to happen. Now, if the cycle lengthens, which is a theory that I've been following for years now, then I would expect new all-time highs well before the next halving out in 2024, but I don't think it's going to happen this year. Or, I mean, again, this year is almost over in a week and a half or so, but I think we need time. I mean, if you think about it, 2021 has mostly just been a sideways year for Bitcoin. 2020 was mostly, at least at the end of 2020, it was mostly up, and then 2021 has been mostly sideways. All right, so now we're basically waiting to see what is 2022 going to be. Is it basically just going to take us back down here into a bear market where we're going to have to come back down to $10,000, spend some time back down there, and then go higher? Or are we gonna continue to maybe play around in this region where we maybe hold at 40K and then go back up? A little bit more bearish scenario would be holding at 30K and then going back up, or just going back up now. I mean, I'm more inclined to think that there's a higher probability that we'll bounce at some point and then trend higher in 2022. But certainly anything's a possibility, and you always have to be prepared for those possibilities. And some people ask me, well, Ben, what happens if we go back to 42K? What happens if we go to 40K? And they say they're going to get liquidated. Look, I mean, first of all, I do not condone leverage trading in this market. Second of all, you have to consider every possible scenario. One scenario that I've seen pop up a lot recently and people are worried about, and we're going to talk about it, and we're not going to just hide behind anything, is the fact that we just had a weekly close below the 50-week moving average. Okay, so we spent a little bit of time below it over here, but then we ultimately bounced. We're back below it again. So what's going to happen? Are we going to bounce? Are we not? Are we going to come back down here? Now, the reason people are worried is because, look, if you look at what's happened historically when we drop below the 50-week moving average, I mean, here we are actually fortunately able to bounce back the following week. We bounced here, but once we got below it here, we had one more rally up to it, and then it ultimately led into a fairly complacent time in the market, and then we had a final capitulation before kicking off the next cycle. Okay, you go back even further, there was another time where we got below the 50-week, and once we got below it, it was pretty much the bad news bears for quite some time. Now, with that said, I mean, this cycle has been, to a large extent, a lot different than prior cycles. So if you're going to take these patterns to the bank, maybe you can cash them in, maybe you won't. What I would say is that for everyone that was counting on this to be a dead cat bounce that was ultimately going to take us back down here immediately, those predictions actually were completely incorrect because we ended up putting in new all-time highs. And this was the first time that we held the bull market support band as support after bouncing off the 50-week moving average after a local top. All right. You look at every prior top. Here we bounced off the 50-week, rejected by the 20. Okay, you go back even further. We bounced off the 50-week, we got above the 20 when we failed to hold it, and then it was just the bad news bears for another year or so. This time, we saw something play out a little bit differently. Okay, what happened? We bounced off the 50-week, we got above the 20, and then we held it as support. And then we put in a new all-time high. So it's interesting because I feel like 2021, and we'll probably do a video on this later, but 2021 has been really the year where the bulls have been right half the time and the bears have been right half the time. And if you think that's not correct, one way to potentially visualize this, and we'll wrap it up at the end of the year with the final numbers and everything, but one way to visualize this is just to look at the months, okay? I mean, look at January, February, and March were green, so that's 3 green months right there. But then April, May, and June were red. Okay, so you're kind of even there on the bulls being right for the first 3 months, the bears being right for the next 3 months. And then we had 2 months where the bulls were right, and then a month where the bears were right. And then another month where the bulls were right. So the bulls were up plus 2 months in terms of monthly ROI. And then November and December, November went to the bears, and December's more than likely going to go to the bears. So you have this case of perma bears, and you have this case of perma bulls, and they've both been right about half the time. And perhaps it's foolish for either side to completely discount the other's line of thinking because, truth be told, you could come up with evidence to support either case. That if you were tasked with the job of finding an asset that you have no stake in or no interest in, and finding a bullish case and finding a bearish case, you could probably find one if you're looking for it. Just same thing with Bitcoin. If you wanted to find a bullish case, you could find one. If you wanted to find a bearish case, you could find one. Namely, the bullish case, as we've discussed, is the idea of lengthening cycles. And so I know a lot of people have been, hopeful that December would be a parabolic month for Bitcoin and that we would go to new all-time highs and we'd have a manic rally to $200,000 or $300,000. And then it would be that simple and that everyone would just sell and we go do it again in a couple of years. But I warned people many times that there's no reason we have to have a parabolic Q4. And in fact, still so far in the third quarter, Bitcoin is still technically up about 6 or 7%. In the fourth quarter, Bitcoin is still up approximately 7%. So it's not like it's been a bad quarter so far. We're still technically up as measured from the start of October. Now we still do have a week and a half to go before we get to the end of the year, so we'll see ultimately where that closes out. But again, the bullish case is, one of the ways you look at the bullish case is you could say, well, historically, market cycles have lengthened significantly. And when we say they've lengthened, not by just a month or two, I know some people are still saying, well, if it's not going to peak in December, we're just going to go to $200,000 or $300,000 by January or February. Look, I highly doubt that too. I highly doubt it. And if you look at the time between these peaks, this was about a year and a half, and this was about a year. So the idea that the next peak would just be another month or so after, I think is highly unlikely. I would say it's more likely. So first of all, I think the most likely scenario is that the cycles lengthen. That's the most likely scenario for me, just because I feel like that's what the data would suggest. But I would say that there's an equally likely possibility between the next two is lengthening cycles and non-diminishing returns. So some people are calling for basically a move where we come back up to $300,000 or $400,000 in either the next month or two or the next, say, 6 or 12 months. I think that's not very likely. But if lengthening cycles, if you just told me, hey, Ben, lengthening cycles and diminishing returns will not play out, if someone from the future could tell me that, lengthening cycles will not play out, what would I think, or lengthening cycles and diminishing returns won't play out, if someone told me that, what would I think the next most probable scenarios would be? I would say, well, it's probably either going to be that 6 to 9K was the top, or we have lengthening cycles and non-diminishing returns, but that the cycle lengthens so much that it gives Bitcoin enough time to reach these much higher valuations, similar in from cycle 2, how we got relatively close to from the returns from cycle 1. But the only way that Bitcoin could even get remotely close to $300,000 this cycle is if the cycle, in my opinion, of course, right, is if the cycle extends way out into 2023. Like you're maybe even like the end of 2023 or early 2024. Like that's the only way I could see something like that realistically playing out. And I mean, of course, I could eat those words, but again, I'd rather be rich than right. And if Bitcoin goes to 300K, that's fine with me. But I would also argue that an equally likely scenario, if you're going to say that the most likely scenario doesn't play out, which I still think it will, would be the other scenario that just 69K is the top. Okay, so when we talk about this, I always talk about probabilities and what I think. And one of the things I drew before is like a probability distribution of where I think the top is. So if you had some like probability and you had, say, the years 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024, the market cycle peak, we drew this out back in 2019, a probability distribution, I would say it looks something like this, where I pretty much butchered that, but the most likely peak is somewhere, in this region, and that it's very unlikely that it's here, and it's also very unlikely that it's way out here. It's probably sometime somewhere in this region. This is what I would think, okay? So, look, I mean, right now Bitcoin is in a downtrend, and we need to break that downtrend, and I'm not going to try to tell you when the downtrend's going to stop. Back in May or June, it was more or less sideways action for a while. It was actually a lot better, I think, than what we're experiencing now. I mean, I guess technically this was a downtrend, but this one seems a bit more unrelenting, because in this one we sort of just got it out of the way, and then we sort of went sideways for a while, and then we had one more bleed before going up. This one has just been straight down, right? I mean, this one has just been straight down, but it's been a slow bleed, right? Rather than just coming down and then going sideways, it's just been a slow bleed. And I think it's really shaking retail out. I really do. So I do think, I do imagine that a lot of people will think the market cycle is over. And there's always a probability. I'm sure there's a certain probability that they're right. I still would argue that time is on our side, that Bitcoin has a ways to go, even if in this moment right now, it does not feel like it. Especially with the dollar. I mean, looking at the dollar, we'd ideally like to see the dollar get rejected somewhere up here and start coming back down, which would be indicative of people taking on a little bit more risk in the markets again, because right now people are going risk off to some degree. We'll see what the new year brings. So what do we want to do right now? The first order of business, we need to break the downtrend. We're still in the downtrend, and I would argue, if you're trying to figure out what Bitcoin's going to do, as I've been saying for the last several weeks, when you're in a downtrend, you're almost better off just assuming it's going to stay in a downtrend until proven otherwise. And eventually it'll turn around, just like eventually it turned around here, just like eventually it turned around here. But think about how many times people tried calling for that turnaround until it actually happened right there. Think about how many times people called for it right here before it finally happened. And now we're just in a third one. A lot of people are going to keep calling for it. I don't know when it's going to happen. It could be here, or we could go back down to 40K. It's possible we even go lower. I mean, one of the things we've looked at before is historically when we hold the bull market support band as support, we don't go below that level. Okay, it's never happened before. That's not to say it can't happen, but it's just simply never happened. Okay, so anytime Bitcoin has held the line at the 20-week, we've never gone below that level in the future for Bitcoin. So, I'd say 40K is a pretty important level. And then, I think the problem with breaking below 40K is that then you have to wonder, okay, well, is 30K gonna hold? Okay, so if you sort of draw these levels out, you have 60K up here, You have 50K, so we'll draw 50K out as well, just so you guys can sort of visualize all of these important levels. You have 40K all the way down here. Okay, so let's maybe like 39. Let me shift that up slightly, up to 40K or so. So let's run 40K. And then, of course, you have 30K, which is all the way down here. All right. So these are the important levels that we basically spent the entire year of 2021 watching. All right. So 2021 has been a sideways year. I would still argue that I think the most likely path for Bitcoin is to have a lengthened cycle and to ultimately put in new all-time highs. But I think you need to be patient. And I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. Like, I don't think we're going to have a parabolic rally tomorrow. So these are the key levels to watch. 40K is certainly a big area. Though I would say the 40K is a pretty important area. That's where we held the line back over here. We've also seen a lot of macro resistance and support at that 42K level because that was the prior local top here. We almost came back down and touched it here. We got rejected by it more or less right there. We got rejected by it right there. We held support on it right here, and we held support at 40K right there as well. We had a wick down right here. So if we were to keep coming back down, we would really like to hold it right there. And if we come back down here, then we basically are going to get super fearful. The market would be super fearful at that point, more so than it is today, because then you have to ask yourself, if the bottom falls out here, are we coming back down that way? So personally, I think that is a very unlikely path to go back down to say 15, 20K. Is it possible? I don't know that 15K is possible. 20K has always been a possibility. Mainly, I mean, you have to look at the 200-week moving average, right? So the 200-week moving average is at 18.6K, and we know that historically for Bitcoin, that is a pretty good turnaround point in the event of a major shakeout. We saw it here and there and there and here as well. So we've seen it a number of times where the 200-week estimate came to the rescue. So while I don't think we're heading there right now, it is always, as I've said before, it is always a theoretical possibility. It was a theoretical possibility back here in the summer as well. I mean, back then the 200-week estimate was actually at 14K. Today it's at 18K, or actually it's approaching 19K. So for me, I would say, again, the most likely scenario that I think is a lengthened cycle and that we will put in new all-time highs, but that right now, the market looks pretty bearish in the short term. And we have some chop here to do below the bull market support band. And we are in a downtrend right now, and we need to break it. And until we break it, until we get out of this rut that we're in, where every impulsive move to the upside just gets instantly sold off, is that you're better off just assuming it's just going to keep trending down until it doesn't, right? I mean, I don't play these games of trying to time it. I don't play that game at all. I just look at the market and try to draw some conclusions from what it's telling me. And I mean, right now the market looks relatively bearish because we're below the bull market support band and we're in a downtrend. Okay, so we're below it, we're in a downtrend. We need to break it. Once we break it, we need to get back to 53K. Once we get there, we need to hold this as support and then continue higher. Until then, the market sentiment will remain very bearish. Okay, you can't argue. I mean, there's really no good argument against that. I mean, I think certainly people do feel at least the overall sentiment in the market is bearish. I mean, of course, people have their theories, like I have mine, and I remain macro bullish. And I think there's a lot of people out there that remain macro bullish. But in the short term, I know a lot of people are tempering their expectations because a downtrend is a downtrend is a downtrend, and you have to break the downtrend before there's really any reason to start looking at new all-time highs. I mean, we're relatively far away from that right now. So again, you can make a case either way. I've told you the evidence obviously is there for either case, the bull case and the bear case. I still lean macro bullish because I think the cycles will lengthen, but at least you can understand why some people would lean macro bearish. So then you need to figure out, based on all the evidence, where do you stand? And I'll continue to try to do the best job I can at showing you, the different ways to look at the market and then why I feel the way I do. So I would argue, again, we're just sort of in no man's land right now, ranging below the 20-week estimate. We're in a downtrend in terms of the daily, but I know some people have said that we're just kind of going sideways. which I guess the sideways mentality comes from the fact that this wick right here means that as long as we're above 43K, we're technically sideways. I think technically that's right, and of course being technically right is the best way to be right. Being technically correct is the best way to be correct. But I also know that it certainly does feel like a downtrend because in terms of daily candles and whatnot, it is a downtrend. So we'll see what happens next week. 2022 will be here before we know it, and we'll also see what happens then if we see some type of shift in investor sentiment or what 2022 will bring. And until then, we're still in the sandbox. We're relegated to the sandbox. We'll keep playing in the sandbox until the time comes to get back above the bull market support band, which again ranges from approximately 51K to 53K. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com. Thank you for tuning in, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.